Have you ever heard the term nested looping? It's a literary term. Malcolm Gladwell is a master at it, by the way. So are the creators of The Simpsons. So I got some of your attention. It's also a characteristic found in African American storytelling and used by a lot of TV shows. Here's how it works. The storytelling has loops in it that are incomplete. It's sometimes called storytelling loops. The storyteller begins one story and then stops without finishing. Starts another story and may start another story. All of them unfinished, a story within a story, until finally all of them get satisfied in the end. Storytelling loops. It's a story within a story. And the name comes from those little nesting dolls. You know what I'm talking about? The little wooden dolls that you open one and there's a doll inside of it, and you open that one, there's a doll inside of it. It's really rare in the biblical narrative. Most Bible stories are straight A to B, but not today. We're in Mark's gospel, and there is a loop. Last week, you recall, Jesus left the Israel side of the Sea of Galilee, crossed over to the Arab side to see the Gerasenes. That's when the boat got rocking, that violent storm. That was the sermon last week. And Jesus demonstrated his power in that story by saying to the wind, "Knock it off." So then, while on the Arab side of the sea, Jesus encounters a man with a demon. He's running wild among the tombs. Jesus shows his power again by commanding the demon to leave and be thrown into the pigs. Well, he is through with that ministry on that side of the sea. He's back in the boat, crossing back over to the Israel side, and we're now in chapter 5, just a chapter removed. And as they get closer, closer, closer to the shore, you can tell there are a crowd of people gathered. There's this huge turnout, everybody waiting to get a glimpse at this person who has a reputation for unusual power. They are gathered deep on the shore. They're waving and eager and hoping to see and touch and beg the miracle worker, pushing like fans at a Bon Jovi concert. I just want to get close. But at the front of the line, there's a man of power and influence. Don't know if he got there early. He might have just said, "Excuse me," and they might have just let him through. He was a big shot, leader of the synagogue. His name is Jairus, and they might have just said, "After you, sir, you need to be up front." But he didn't look much like a big shot when Jesus stepped off the boat and he dropped to his face, plopped down at the feet of Jesus and started begging. His little girl is near death. He is absolutely desperate. And he begs Jesus, "Please, please do something." My friend Bob Browning has a great saying. He says, "You're only as happy as your unhappiest child." That might be right. The big shot, the synagogue leader says to Jesus, "My daughter is at the point of death. Come lay your hands on her that she might be made well and live." And Jesus leaves with him. And the story's suspended. Here comes the nested loop. There's a story inside the story. Jesus is on his way when another character, another story is introduced. A woman who's been suffering for 12 years with an issue of female bleeding has found no relief. She's tried everything. She's gone to doctors. She's run through all her money. She's trying to find a cure, and she's worse. But here is this powerful man who's said to heal the sick. And she says to herself, "There's just no way I can get an audience with this miracle worker. For one, I'm a woman, and women in this culture amount to next to nothing. And secondly, my bleeding makes me ceremonially unclean. If I touch him or anybody else, they're going to be unclean too. Nobody's going to give me the time of day. And now I've spent all my money on doctors. In addition to all of that, I'm broke. So yeah, broke, bleeding, and female, like I'm getting to the front of this line. So she muscles her way forward and with a profound faith just reaches out all she can, just so her finger can touch his cloak. And immediately, the gospel writer's favorite word, Mark's favorite word, immediately she was healed. That's enough. She got what she wanted. But Jesus is aware that some measure of power has left his body, and he turns into the pressing crowd and says, "Who touched my clothes?" Now keep in mind, Jairus' daughter is still near death. Or what about her? The story is suspended, nested loop. We have a story, a new character introduced, 2 open screens, 2 stories, and a main character in each. Jairus, a man, popular, powerful, religious figure, privileged and accepted. And a woman with no standing, not even given a name, but identified by her disease. She's ritually unclean and broke. So all of this is adding to the confusion. Do you see? We've got a story that's half told. People are pressing. Mark's using the word immediately. Now there's a second story that's begun. It's not closed. I mean, it's just chaos everywhere. It's like all the kitchen timers went off at one time. You got all this pawing and sweat and frenzy, and someplace Jesus has to be. He's on a mission. There's a girl dying. He's got work to do. And a woman just touches his fabric on his cloak. And Jesus stops everything and says, "Who touched me?" Now, when Jesus stops in the middle of all this, the disciples seem a little bit annoyed. Jesus, we've got places to be. You don't have time for this. Look at this mob. How can you even know who touched you? I mean, what do you mean? There are 50 people grabbing at you at one time. You do not have time for this. We've got places we've got to be. And Jesus responds. Notice here the difference between the response of Jesus and the disciples who also represent us. They're in a hurry. They're ready to do the next thing. They're ready to get the to-do list checked off. But Jesus stops. A hurting woman needs his attention. She's afraid. And is she going to be in trouble? I mean, she's unclean after all. She touched somebody else. Does that make them ceremonially unclean? She falls in front of him in fear and tells him everything. And when she does, Jesus, who has stopped all the chaos, says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed." In all the urgency and chaos and demands of his day, when confronted with human hurt, Jesus stops what is urgent to do what is important. When I was a seminary student, I served as an associate of a small church in Warrenton, North Carolina. I was kind of a part-time youth minister. My pastor, an early mentor for me, Ed Bedingfield, one day was complaining about all the interruptions. He just had that week just one interruption after another. And he said this has been its way his whole ministry. So he'd plan out the week, he'd schedule the week. He said it used to drive him crazy, that after he'd get everything on the calendar, there's just one interruption after another. And then he said to me, it used to drive me crazy, all these people interrupting my ministry, till I realized that the interruptions are my ministry. Most of the other stuff's just work. I want to get better at that. This past Wednesday was my twins' 29th birthday. Haley was born at 9:21 a.m. Brendan was born 9 minutes later, 9:30. So I set an alarm on my phone for 9:21 and 9:30 so I could call each of them that morning on their birthday. But I want you to hear the confession that's in that. I set an alarm because I was at risk of not calling my children that morning on their birthday. I had to set an alarm. How many meaningful conversations did I miss this week because I was already pressing into the next thing? It's hard to know. It's hard to know what we don't see in a given week. How much hurt did we not slow down for this week? How much loneliness did we not attend? How much authentic human connection did we just speed past because there was something else to get done on the list? I too often find myself like the disciples, looking at my watch, looking to what's next, and trying to get something checked off. But if we are going to be shaped in the way of Jesus, it means being attuned to what is important and not just captive to what is most urgent. Jesus turns to the unclean woman in the gospel. And by the way, the gospel writer in this little passage uses the word touch 4 times in 5 verses, and he blesses her and he heals her. And then our story within the story is satisfied. And we return to the opening story. Jesus does make his way to the home of Jairus, where folks are already waiting and wailing and sobbing because it's too late. The 12-year-old little girl is dead. Until Jesus touches her too. He took her hand and said, Talitha cum. Little girl, get up. And another life is healed. Nobody is beyond the reach of God's love. Jesus has come for the most prominent man in town and the most marginalized. The only thing that the woman and Jairus have in common is that they both had faith that Jesus was the answer. One takeaway from this story is that Jesus came for all of us regardless of our station. But there's another takeaway, and that is that Jesus has modeled for us what it means to just slow down and pay attention to the pain that's all around us. And when Jesus got off the boat that day, there's no way he could have known he was going to Jairus' house. No way he could have known he was going to be touched by this woman in pain. He might have had a to-do list that day too. But it got put aside when he confronted the pain in front of him. If we're going to be shaped in the way of Jesus, it means being attuned to what's important, not just being captive to what's urgent. In July of 2015, the recording artist Brandy was on a New York subway, and she decided to sing a song and film it to put on her blog. So while riding the subway, she pulls out her phone and starts singing a Whitney Houston song. Packed subway. And not one soul on the subway knew that it was a Grammy Award-winning artist who had sold over 40 million records, because they were not paying attention to what was present. They were focused on what is next. In May of 1999, I was at the School of Theology at Mercer. That May was going to be our first graduation in the history of the school. 1,000 details. The dean, Alan Culpepper, had stacks on his desk. We'd never done this before. There are 1,000 things to do. And that week, the week of the very first graduation of our school, the dad of one of our professors, Lloyd Allen, died in Alabama. His funeral was going to be about 3 days before our very first graduation. And that week, early in the morning, Alan Culpepper and Truett Gannon and I piled into Truett Gannon's car and drove all the way to Cuba, Alabama. Anybody know where Cuba is? It's almost Mississippi. I asked the dean on the way there, how in the world are you able to pull this off? It's graduation week. There are 1,000 details on your desk waiting for your attention. How can you take an entire day that it takes to go from Atlanta to Cuba, Alabama and back? How can you take all day for a funeral? He said, I have a 5-year rule and it meets my 5-year rule. I said, what is that? He said, in 5 years, this will have mattered. 5 years from now, if I'd stayed at my desk, it had just been another work day. If we're going to be shaped into the way of Jesus, it means being attuned to what's important and not just captive to what's urgent. Let's stand and sing.